Our presenter is Cheryl Ganz. She's a Smithsonian Institution Creator Emeritus, following her retirement as the Chief Curator of Philately at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. They need acronyms for some of this stuff. And as lead curator of the William H. Gross Stamp Gallery, the world's largest postage stamp gallery. He currently serves on the American Philatelic Society's Board of Vice Presidents as the USA Midwest representative. She's also the USA Midwest representative of the Royal Philatelic Society of London, and ex officio member of its council, and is a member on the U.S. Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee, the committee that selects subjects and approves designs for U.S. postage stamps. Her exhibits, research, writing, and speaking relate to the worldwide Zeppelin posts and memorabilia. She edited and co-edited the Zeppelin Collector for 37 years and currently administers the Zeppelin Collector Facebook group. Philatelic recognitions include the role of Distinguished Philatelists, APS Luft Award for Exceptional Contributions to Philately, Smithsonian Philatelic Achievement Award, Smithsonian Research Award, Alfred F. Lichtenstein Memorial Award, Mortimer L. Niken Medal, Carl Richard Bruhl Medal, RPSL Lee Medal, and the APS Single Frame Champion of Champions. Dr. Ganz earned her PhD in U.S. history from the University of Illinois at Chicago. She authored and collaborated publications including the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, A Century of Progress, Delivering Hope, FDR and Stamps of the Great Depression, Fire and Ice, Hindenburg and Titanic, Pacific Exchange, China and U.S. Mail, Every Stamp Tells a Story, the National Philatelic Collection, and Zeppelin Hindenburg, an illustrated history of LZ-129 plus more than 100 articles. I'll give you all Cheryl.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So I call this Zeppelin Matchmaker. Of course, we think of a matchmaker as someone who brings a couple people together, hopefully making a good match between them that'll last a lifetime. And so we're caretakers of our philately, and every once in a while, I'll find an item that was separated from another item back in time. And lo and behold, in my searching through auctions and shoeboxes, I bring two items together, or back together, that used to be together. Or I not only can match items together, I've matched research with items. And I find this very rewarding. And I'm hoping during the Q&A time, in addition to talking about some Zeppelin things, this talk, when you talk about matchmakers, it's not just about Zeppelins, it can be anything in philately. So I'm hoping this will trigger some thoughts of a couple items you might have found and brought together unexpectedly. I think most of the matchmaking I've done, I haven't gone out in my life and said, I'm looking for this item. It's more that I was aware maybe it might be in the world somewhere, and if I'm lucky, I might in my lifetime find it. And some items just never in my imagination knew they could be there. So let's go forward and match up some stuff. I'm going to talk about 5 different stories, 4 airships. One airship has 2 different flights I'll talk about. So first I'm going to talk about this Zeppelin. For those, I'm sure most of you are aware, a Zeppelin is a very large flying vehicle. It's got a framework on the inside made of a lightweight metal covered with a fabric, and inside are gas cells that are usually filled with hydrogen or helium that's lighter than air, giving it a chance to have lift and then engine power moving it forward. So after World War I and Germany lost, and they had a lot of Zeppelins flying in World War I, but when they lost, they had to give up their fleets of aircraft, and the United States didn't get one of them. Instead, they negotiated to have a Zeppelin built for them, for the US Navy. And it's this ship here. It was the Zeppelin Company's LZ 124. That means it was the 124th Zeppelin design. They didn't build that many, but that many designs. And it was known, as you can see at the top, it says ZR3. That's actually the US Navy designation, ZR3. And so this was built and flew to the United States in 1924. Here you can see it with its hangar in Friedrichshafen, Germany. So I'm going to talk about bringing together two pieces from a trial flight of this before it came to the United States. So the LZ-126, not yet named the Los Angeles, that would come later, had 6 trial flights. And the 5th trial flight was a big circle flight around Germany called the Greater Germany Flight. And at various cities, it would drop mail, mostly postcards, in bags like this. So I bought this mail bag when I was in my 20s. I got it in a Roger Corber auction. And you can see it's kind of a waxy substance, probably to make it waterproof. Inside it would hold a couple pieces. In fact, this held 3 postcards. At the bottom was sewn some sand that would give it some weight to pull it down to the earth. And at the top is a very long ribbon. It's many feet long. And that's so when they dropped it, people on the ground would see that streamer and somebody would run to find this bag. And as the message says, it's airmail post. And would the finder please take it to the local post office? So that was the goal. On this one, then, of course, the person who did find it wrote a little message on it as well to say they found it. So goal in life, if I could ever find one of those 3 cards, but at the time I bought this bag, flight drop bag, none of those 3 had ever surfaced on the philatelic market. So this is what it looks like when you have someone dropping it. This is an officer, Anton Widemann, on the Graf Zeppelin, and they simply open the window and wait for the right moment and drop it out. By the time the Hindenburg was flying, they no longer allowed this to be done because it was too dangerous if one of these got caught in one of the propellers of an engine. But in the earlier times, they did this drop mail. And the other interesting thing about drop mail is most of the time, it was not prepared in advance by stamp collectors. Rather, they were cards written by crew members, passengers on board, or friends of someone on the flight. So here's the card. This is one of the 3 cards that was inside that waxed bag. And I acquired this almost 40 years after I had bought the drop bag. So what happened is when the Zeppelin was flying its circle flight, it flew over the town of Flensburg. This is in the Schleswig-Holstein region of Germany up in the north. And it's the hometown of Hugo Eckener, the captain of the airship. And so of the 3 cards dropped, and we know this because of newspaper accounts at the time, 1 card was dropped to the local newspaper to give them information. 1 card was dropped to a family member, and then this card was dropped, which has nothing to do with anyone who was on board the ship, but you can see it's addressed to Friedrichshafen, so most likely the sender knew someone in the crew or who was taking the flight. And in his message, he says, I haven't been lucky enough to fly on this ship, but I hope you enjoy the message. So a friend had this in that pouch for him, and it got dropped. So when this came to light, the family that had received it, after 2 generations, someone in the family decided to see if this was worth anything, and they were told to get it expertized. So they sent it to an expertiser in Germany, and it was discovered to be good. And they said, well, what do you think it's worth? And of course, it's in a catalog. So the expertiser said, well, not only can I tell you what I think it's worth, but I know someone who might be very interested. And he contacted me, and I made an offer of twice the catalog value, of twice the going value at the time. And the couple, an elderly couple, said, well, not philatelist. Said, well, gee, if she offers that much money, it must be worth more than she's offering. So they decided to put it in auction instead. And so I bid in auction and I was able to acquire it for much less than I had originally offered them. So I was the winner in that one. Not only did I receive the card, but I was able to match up the card and the drop bag from 1924 to, not that many years ago. So it was 75 years apart and I brought them back together. Next, I want to show a story of bringing together some items from the Shenandoah. This is a U.S. Navy Zeppelin. It's known as the ZR1, so it was the first Zeppelin the U.S. Navy had. There was a Zeppelin in World War I, the L-49, that was brought down by planes, brought down intact in France. And so the French copied every detail of that ship and shared the plans with the Allies, Great Britain and the United States. And both those countries built a Zeppelin based on those designs from a downed airship. So the Shenandoah flew in 1923, 24, and unfortunately, 1925 crashed over Ohio. By the way, in this photograph, it's attached to a mooring mast on a ship known as the USS Potomac. So when I was a curator at the Smithsonian, we were able to get the Benjamin K. Miller exhibit collection to put on exhibit. And at that time, I was the assistant curator under Wilson Home. Some of you might have known him. And included in the Miller collection was a pretty good classic airmail collection. And so I was assigned to be responsible for that in the exhibit. And when I started going through it and I came to this cover, I was just stunned. It's not recorded at that time in the literature anywhere, and it's a piece of drop mail from the Shenandoah. Now, I cannot own this. It's owned by the Benjamin K. Miller Collection. It's on display at the Smithsonian, but it's owned by the New York Public Library. And because of the donor requirements, it can never be publicly sold. So all I can do is own an image of this. But nonetheless, I was so excited about it that I wrote an article about it at the time. And on the back of it, a person who found it, or wrote a note about they found it and they delivered it to the post office, and then it was delivered to this Mr. Dudley Jones. So I wrote an article, and I thought that would be the end of the story. Well, lo and behold, probably a decade passed, and a lot came up on eBay. And I don't think anyone else kind of got what it was all about except me. But here we have the young 8-year-old boy grown up who received that piece of mail. And here he tells things about the story that I didn't know at the time. Like when it was dropped in a tin can filled with sand. So that provided the weight. And then it had some kind of streamer parachute, which wasn't really too well clarified. And he explains that he received it. And at the time, he wasn't going to ever part with that, except that he was made an offer by Scott Coin and Stamp Company for $25 for the envelope after it had dropped. So he did sell it. Now, I happen to know that that was Norman Surfos who bought it. And he built a big airmail collection, which he then traded to the Benjamin K. Miller collection after Miller's death. He traded it to the New York Public Library for duplicates of classic US material in the collection. And that is how it's now in the Miller collection. But what is the fun part of this story is not only did I buy this news clipping that filled in blank information, I bought the streamer that was attached to the tin can dropped from the Shenandoah. And it is the commissioning pennant of the Shenandoah. That means when the US Navy commissioned the ship, this pennant was hanging from the bow, and later it was put inside the ship. And when the crew member wanted to drop this near the home of the young boy, he found the streamer in the ship, attached it to the can, and away it went. And the idea that I could ever own a Zeppelin commissioning streamer is one thing, but then to know I got the one that dropped mail just was a dream too good to be true. And so while I can't bring the cover into my collection, I could bring the story of the picture and the streamer all together. So that's my Shenandoah matchmaker. My next story is about the Graf Zeppelin. The Graf Zeppelin is probably the most successful airship ever. It flew a long time, from 1928 to 1936, all over the world. Aerial Globetrotter is a nickname it had, and it certainly fit the bill. Here it's in 1933 in the hangar in Akron, Ohio. And it just was such a successful ship. When so many Zeppelins had crashes, this one just was one success story after another. And it carried mail on a lot of its flights. And of course, the reason it carried mail, it was the whole idea of these Zeppelins was to build a worldwide network to replace ships. It was the new long distance air carrier. And it would do just what ships did, carry passengers, freight, and mail. And that mail helped pay for its operating costs. So the mail sent by collectors was essential for these ships in their running. So 4 Zeppelin stamps were issued by the United States with the Graf Zeppelin on them. 3 stamps in 1930 and 1 stamp in 1933. So if you look very carefully at this, you can see an impression in the very center of this of the 65-cent US postage stamp. When this was in auction, it was identified by the auction as an albino proof. Now that's not what it is, but that's how the auction misidentified. Anyhow, I bought it very reasonable price. It was a fun piece. I talked to James Lee, who's a famous dealer for proof material, and he confirmed what I thought, and it's the blotter from behind a proof. So somewhere along the way, the blotter behind the proof and the proof became separated. And they didn't use glue to attach these, but the impression is very deep on this of the 65-cent stamp. So here you can see what the 65-cent proof actually looks like. On the left is what we call a large die proof, and on the right is what we call the small die proof. So Jim and I both believed, and for a long time, have believed that of this era, all the die proofs were probably made from one die, and that small die proofs are just cut down from large die proofs. And but it was very hard to prove that. It was just kind of the theory that most people who collect this kind of material had. So the nice thing about proofs is the impressions are just stunning because it's the single die, a single print impression, hand done. It is truly a piece of artwork. And you know, the engraving is absolutely exquisite. But I was able to confirm that it was a single die because the Bureau of Engraving and Printing still had all the dies, and they didn't make those accessible for researchers, but they did at one point transfer them all to the USPS post office. And I was able to get permission to look at all the Zeppelin dies at the post office headquarters. And so I can confirm of the 4 US Zeppelins, there is only 1 die for each. They are covered with wax and then this waxy paper over them, so that on the left is the back side of the die, and on the other side, the right, is the front. But now these have been transferred to the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, but they will only be cleaned as needed for exhibits, because the cost of a conservator to clean this wax off the front of the die it's very time consuming and costly. So it'll only be done on an as needed basis. But it did prove the theory that there is only one die. So here I have my large die proof reattached to my blotter. So when these were actually created, the piece of paper for the proof was placed on top of the blotter, and the printing press put 3,000 pounds of pressure on that die to attach the proof paper to the blotter. That's why you have such a deep impression in the blotter. And there was no glue holding them together. It was just that 3,000 pounds of pressure made them attached. If you really played with it, you could separate them. And over time, I'm sure in some collections where stuff is exposed to heat and cold, it makes it more likely that they would separate. Some die proof paper has been trimmed around the edges where you can see where the pressure was from the plate. And sometimes the paper was not trimmed. In this case, it was not trimmed. Now I'm going to talk about the 1933 Zeppelin stamp, the 50-cent stamp. And this is the one that flew on the Chicago flight, flew from Germany to Brazil to the United States and then back to Germany. This is one of my specialty collections. And I was very, very lucky to be able to obtain the original ink wash artwork for that stamp. And this is done by Victor McCloskey of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And just, you know, artwork out of the BEP is not commonly on the market, but each artist in the BEP, engraver, artist, and even the chief officer, director, they were allowed to have a portfolio of their artwork so that if they left for another position, they could show their capability. And of course, when some of them died, then their families put that on the market in an auction or private sale. And that's the only reason a few exceptional pieces are out there. And so I feel very honored to be the caretaker for this one. And so here you have one of the small die proofs, so you can see how the artwork was translated into the engraving. When Victor did the ink wash, he worked from photographs. A photograph of the Zeppelin. At the left is the federal building at the Chicago World's Fair. It was sent a photograph from the fair organizers. And at the right is the hangar in Friedrichshafen, Germany, and he took that out of a book. And I've been able to identify the book where he took it from. So then when it's translated to an engraving, McCloskey did part of the engraving, but someone else would do the lettering, and yet a third engraver would do the numeral. So it was a team effort at the BEP to do this. So it was exciting. These were both items created inside the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C., and I was able to bring the two together. But I had a surprise yet to discover that I had no idea existed. And that is an original sketch before the ink wash was ever done. And this is signed by the artist, who happens to be the director of the BEP, Alvin Hall. And he was at a dinner, and he was sitting next to someone at dinner and took the napkin from dinner and drew this sketch on the napkin and gave it to his co-dinner partner. And if you look, you can see the hangar at right. The Zeppelin's been turned around and the federal building at left. On the date that he did this is before the 3 design models had been finished. They did 3 designs, not knowing which of the 3 would be selected. Clearly, Alvin already had one in mind that he had favored. And so very excited. I bought this original sketch in a German auction. Somebody in Europe somehow acquired this, and I never had known it existed. So now I've brought these 3 wonderful items together. And then my final story is about bringing together items from the Hindenburg disaster. The Hindenburg was certainly the most glorious Zeppelin engineering masterpiece. Unfortunately, had a short life. It first flew in 1936, and the crash was May 6, 1937 at Lakehurst, New Jersey. It was the first flight of the 1937 season, but it was the 11th round trip to North America. It also flew many times to South America. So it's kind of in this photograph, it almost looks like it's crashing into the mooring mast. In fact, it's pretty far away from it. But the Zeppelin was coming in for a landing. It was running late. Been thunderstorms, so there'd been delays in the flight. And after it got over the field, if you look carefully, you can see the lines hanging from the ship to the ground, the dropped lines for the landing party. And the burst into flames happened just moments after the ship ropes landed on the ground, which was wet and from the rainstorms, and changed the grounding of the ship. And so it takes two things for a ship like this to burst into flames. And remember, this ship is filled with hydrogen. It takes a spark, and it takes loose hydrogen mixed with oxygen. So there are many theories how a spark was created, and there are many theories of how the hydrogen leaked to mix with the air. And of course, some theories are more credible than others, but there is no way to date we can do absolute proof. We can just have, some theories look much better than others. When you look up to the bow, which when the fire started at the top in the rear, the nose of the ship went up, and you can see where the name of the ship is. And just below that, you can see the control car where the officers would be. And about halfway back toward the fire are windows where the passengers would be. It took only 34 seconds for the Hindenburg to be completely consumed in flames. And so it's almost impossible to believe that any person or any male could survive. And yet, of the 97 people on board, 62 survived, 2/3. There are a lot of good reasons for that. And one is, that a lot of people were by the windows, and the officers in the control car and the engines were near escape routes. But the mail wasn't always necessarily in such a convenient place. And I'll talk a little more about how that would survive. So they found mail that had been burnt in several places in the ship, in several findings as they went that very night through the smoldering wreckage. These are not postal inspectors, these are customs inspectors. Customs and agriculture in the United States got to look at everything before the post office could get their hands on anything. But you can see here they're looking through one of the piles of burnt mail. After they released this burnt mail to the post office, and the post office went through and looked at the addresses and made a list of all the addressees. If they couldn't read the address, if it was from someone on board the ship, they still saved it and returned it to the crew member or the passenger. Otherwise, if you couldn't read the address, they destroyed whatever was left. The mail that was saved and put on lists was put in glassine envelopes undercover and sent to the postmaster in the town, whether in the United States or Europe, of the addressee, and then it was hand delivered almost like registered mail. So they were sure people received whatever survived. So over 17,000 pieces of mail, less than 400 pieces survived. Of that less than 400, about half are burnt, and about half are not burnt because they were in a fireproof container waiting to be postmarked on the return flight. So you can see where he's holding a piece of mail in his hand that doesn't appear to be burnt at all. And that is most likely one of those pieces that was in a fireproof container. So these are two examples of burnt mail that I, as a matchmaker, brought together. They had not seen each other since they were sitting in the burning wreckage together, not next to each other, and I'll explain that. So first, let me talk about the one on the top. Both of these covers have what you would call onboard postmarks. They are well known as Hindenburg had its own post office, and they canceled mail, they sold stamps, they had a postal service on board. But the top cover was not actually postmarked on board, even though it has an onboard postmark. So what's the story on that? If a collector, and here this is a dealer, it's addressed to Rudolf Hindenburg. If a collector or dealer wanted mail, they would send it in undercover to go on the Hindenburg. They could request an onboard cancel. And in this case, they received that cancel, but the cancel was applied at the Frankfurt Railroad Station post office. Then the mail was put in mail bags along with all the mail that just received the regular postmark, tightly packed and sealed in mail bags, and put into storage locker, the post office storage locker, in the airship, which was right above the gondola. So this postmark, though, you'll notice is different than the postmark on the other cover. And here's why. This postmark was never supposed to be used in 1937. It was a 1936 postmark. They were waiting for the new 1937 postmark to arrive, and it was late. And they couldn't wait because they had to get all this mail postmarked. So they took a 1936 postmark and reconfigured it to use it for 1937. And that's the mail that postmarked at the railroad station as that reconfigured onboard postmark. Only a handful of these have survived. The fun thing about this cover at the top is if you look at the far left, right here and over in here, looks like kind of dark green ink. That is actually melted girder undercoating. It was an undercoating put on the metal so that it wouldn't rust. And it was actually blue in color, but when it was on fire, it turned to a dark green, and drips of it landed on this envelope, which certainly adds kind of a little fun to it. Now, let's talk about the one below it. That's an onboard postmark that was actually postmarked on the Hindenburg in flight. So only a couple of these covers have survived with this postmark. The passenger who mailed this bought the postcard on board, wrote the postcard, put it in a slot in the mailbox in the reading and writing room. And then once a day, Max Zabel, who was the postmaster on board, would go pick up the mail and cancel it. And then he would put it in a bag for departure. So that's what happened with this. This was mailed on board, postmarked on board, and then did not survive too well. But what's another interesting thing is I want you to, for those who do know German, I know a couple of you do, you'll see down at the lower left, it says Rauschzimmer. This is a postcard of the smoking room on board the Hindenburg, which is almost kind of a weird thing to have the smoking room all burnt up. And then here, not only did I match those two pieces together, I was able to match the actual postmark device salvaged out of the wreckage. So after the customs officers and officials went through the wreckage of the Hindenburg, the next day, crew members were allowed to go and look for their own personal possessions. You know, of course, they knew where their bunks were, they knew where their stations were, and they were allowed back in. And Rudolf Sauter, the chief engineer, found this. It would have been near the control room because the mail room was right above the control room. And what's missing is the wooden handle burned off, the rubber lettering, and then there was a mechanism where you could turn the date for the date stamp inside, and those pieces have all melted down. But this is the only one on board. It is the hand stamp from the postmark of the Hindenburg. And Rudolf Sauter gave it to an American stamp collector friend of his named Bill Schneider, and Bill gave it to me. So I've been able to bring the two surviving postmarks together as well as the device. And this is my final slide. I want to tell you the story of the man who wrote this postcard. His name is Bert Dolan. And Bert was a Chicagoan in the perfume business. And he was in Europe on a business trip, going to see buyers and sellers and so forth. And while he was over there, he ran into another Chicagoan he knew named Nelson Morris. And Nelson was from one of the families that owned one of the big meatpacking industries in Chicago. And so the two of them had dinner together, and Nelson had a ticket to fly home on the Hindenburg. And he said to Bert, "Why don't you get a ticket and fly home with me? You will be home in time for Mother's Day and you can surprise your wife and children." And Bert said, "Well, you know, I promised my wife I wouldn't fly on an airplane while I was in Europe." And he says, "Well, you know, this isn't an airplane, this is the Zeppelin, it's perfectly safe." And so then he sweetened the suggestion by saying, "I'll tell you what, if you fly on the Hindenburg, I'll pay for your ticket." And at that time, that was $400 in the Great Depression. That was a fair amount of money. And so Bert just couldn't refuse. So the two of them took the flight together, and they spent a fair amount of time in the smoking room, where the smoking room was a bar, and they could drink in there and tell stories and have fun. It was only 2.5 days to get to the United States, and they had a room to sleep in as well. So then when they're coming in for the landing, they're both by one of the big observation windows to look for anyone they might know below and enjoy the moment. And when the crash happened, when the ship burst into flames, there was an immediate shudder, and the nose of the ship went up so that a lot of people kind of fell to the floor and had to get themselves back up and get out the windows. But both of them were by a window, and the windows were open at the same time. They were able to get right by the window, so Nelson jumped out first. He jumped to the ground before the ship went up too high and ran off. And then Bert jumped out after him. And Nelson turned around, and Bert wasn't coming out from the smoking wreckage. And the reason was, when Bert jumped to the ground, instead of immediately running away from the ship, he turned to help the next person jumping. And at that moment, burning girder wreckage fell on him, trapping him, so he didn't survive. So Bert's family is back in Chicago, wife and children, and they don't know that he was on board the ship. They've seen the news. I mean, it was headline photographs in the front page everywhere the next day. So Nelson Morris contacted a friend of his in Chicago to go to the home to break the news to the family. And then later, an official came with his personal belongings that were removed from his body and so forth. And in his pocket, there was a letter to his wife in a sealed envelope. And I've seen and held it myself and read it. It's not something, it's too private to publish. But his granddaughter was kind enough to let me read the letter. And it's a couple-page letter, and he tells his wife all about his trip. And he says, "I know I told you I wouldn't fly." He said, "But it was too good to pass this up. If anything happens to me, please know it was God's will." You can just imagine the wife reading this letter, last letter her husband wrote to her on board the ship. And so when you think of the crash, when you watch the film and you hear the recording, it's so famous, Herb Morrison recording radio announcement of the airship coming in. It goes, "Oh, the humanity." And I think as collectors, we bring together the objects and the stories, and we tell the humanity. And that's part of the power of philately. And it's what sustains my interest in care and keeps me going, because I want to share all these stories. Thank you very much.